Hello, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our November IWA region webinar. So I think we'll make a start. I'm delighted that AJ from the Thames 21 has agreed to come and give this talk. He was originally going to give it to the South London branch in person in May, and unfortunately that couldn't happen, but he's kindly said he's willing to do it in this manner as a webinar. AJ is one of the Thames, he's in a joint role, I believe it is, as Thames River Watch coordinator. And some of you may be aware that there have been a number of cleanups on the river and also on the canals that the Thames 21 group are very much involved in, not only leading, but training people so as they know how to go about these sort of work properly and safely. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to AJ for his talk. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Libby. And it's really nice to be here. So what I'm going to talk about really is a little bit about the work that Thames 21 have done. But I also just wanted to step back a little bit and look at just some of the challenges that we might experience trying to protect an estuary like the Tidal Thames, and some of the partnership kind of setups that we're trying to get put into place to make that happen. So talk a little bit about the generic difficulties. I'll talk a little bit about the history, very briefly, just cover sort of how the river has declined, but also made a recovery, but what we might be looking forward, the threats that might be coming down the line. That's the first part. The second part, I'm going to look at catchment partnerships. So it's a collective response, and an estuary of this size and complexity really needs lots of partners. And I'll look a little bit into some of the things that have gone on, some of the things that are hard about that, but also some of the opportunities. And there might be this might be appropriate as well for the IWA in terms of being a partner and thinking, might start you thinking about ways in which you might want to engage with the catchment partnership around the Tidal Thames. And then the third part, which I'll spend more time on, is looking at Thames River Watch, which is the project that I coordinate. And we'll go a little bit more into detail as one of the projects that is happening under the catchment partnership. But there are many others as well. So I'll just go a little bit about the Tidal Thames. I mean, I'm sure many of you will know this, but it is, I suppose it's a spectacular estuary. It's 92 miles long, almost 250 square kilometers of water when the tide is in. So it's a huge, huge area. It's very tidal. The tidal range, the difference between high tide and low tide sometimes can be as much as 7 meters. And also, in most parts of London, it's a third smaller than it would have been in Roman times. So just by nature of building and encroaching and taking away a lot of the salt marsh, particularly in London, it's a lot smaller than it would have been. So it moves even faster. And there are certain sections within the middle of London that it's very difficult for wildlife and fish to migrate through, because it's moving so fast. It's obviously very populated, so it's one of the most densely populated urban areas in Europe. 8.6 million people, and that's projected to grow. So I think in 15 years it should be about 10 million, and by 2050 they're expected to be over 11 million. So there's a lot of building pressure and development pressure. It's also sinking. So we're still rebound. This is published about 10 years ago, I think, this research that the southeast of England is sinking as the north is rebounding up after the ice age. The southeast is sinking down a little bit. So I think I can't remember exactly how much it is, but it's significant, and that's important because not only do we have climate change, we also have the fact that the sea level was rising on this part of the country anyway. So that's an extra challenge. Now, this is very unscientific. This is something that just a history of water quality as an illustration. And we just use this for our own volunteers in terms of giving them a little bit of the broad spectrum. But I thought I'd use it just as an illustration, a little bit of some of the challenges that water quality and the natural environment in the tidal Thames has faced over the last 200 or 300 years. So I use this just because it's not as simple as the water quality having been really good is really bad and then has recovered. It's a little bit more complicated than that. So you could say really that, I suppose, humans' first major impact on the tidal Thames was the loss of habitat, so encroachment, drainage, and building on top of what is ecologically very productive and very valuable salt marsh. So salt marsh particularly valuable for the spawning of young fish, some nursery. They're also very productive areas. So even though some things there aren't that many different species that can always adapt to the changing environments of the estuaries, the ones that do are very, very productive. The Industrial Revolution was had a major impact. So heat pollution, but also a lot of chemical pollution, a lot of particularly the sewer system. So there's a fascinating, if you ever get a chance on the Thames Water Sewers Week to go down the sewers, I recommend you take it. They generally have a few tickets open to the public, and I think it's in June. And there's a fantastic lecture that you can get all about the development of the sewers. And I learned that the word sewer actually comes from the, originally used to mean drainage. It wasn't used the way we use it now, but basically London developed before they actually had a way of getting rid of the water. So obviously people just collected their toilets to the nearest river. And so when Bazalgette came along at the end of the 19th century, 1860, he had no choice but to create a combined system where all the fresh water from the rain had to link up with all the sewer water. But the Great Stink, I think is 1854, 1506, led to Parliament having to move, as many of you will know. When the Bazalgette sewage system, which is still in place now and still in very good condition, this fantastic piece of engineering, that had a measurable impact, and so water quality improved. Funnily enough, the bomb damage during the war, but also had an impact on the sewers and had an impact on the river, because the Luftwaffe targeted the flood defences in central London. A lot of the flood defences were also the sewers. The main sewer runs along by the riverfront. So that had an effect, and it really took until the 60s before a lot of that they were able to rebuild it. But obviously also the rise of industry had a significant impact. Legislation, both domestic and from the European Union, has had a big impact from the 70s on. So water quality now is actually probably better than a lot of people think. So it's common, at least for us, when we're dealing with volunteers and local communities, that people will look at the river and look at the brown colour, and therefore make the assumption that it's therefore polluted, which in fact, of course, it's not. That's not necessarily the case. But as we know, there is a major problem with it's still a combined system, and so it means that whenever it rains in London, really doesn't need very much rain at all. The sewers are already so full because of the population, and we have paved over so many of our green spaces now that there's very little soakage in London going into the water table from rainwater, that a lot of that water goes straight into the sewers. The sewers can't cope, and therefore either the sewage is pumped directly into the river, or it overflows, depending. So that still happens. And in the summer months in particular, that's a particular issue. So in the summer months, when you get less rain, you get lower levels of water in the river, and you also get bigger showers. So you get higher concentrations of sewage in the river. It's also warmer. That's when you get the really low oxygen conditions in the river. So that is still an issue, and that is still one of the things that is obviously very bad for recreation in the river, but it's also a significant issue for fish, especially young fish, because the low oxygen events that you get from that can wipe fish populations out. So we still happening, and it's a big issue. So in fact, I'll say here that actually the project that I'm working on is funded by the Tideway sewer. So the Tideway is a company which is in place solely for the purpose of building this overflow sewer. And this is a 16-mile sewer that goes from the west of London to East London, following the course of the river. It's right underneath it. It's about 7 meters wide. And it's basically designed to go along to all the intercept points, or the main intercept points. And it intercepts where the sewers would have overflown into the river, and instead drops that sewage down into the tunnel, and it directs it to the sewage treatment in Barking. So that is being built at the moment, and they're spending a lot of money on it. They're spending roughly about £4 billion on it. And if you ever get to see, BBC have done a couple of episodes, and they're due to do another one, I think it's called the £4 billion sewer, or maybe the £5 billion sewer, if you add the other works onto it. And that's a fantastic bit of TV, actually. I really recommend you watch it. But that is a huge, huge investment. And there's quite a lot of fanfare around it, in the sense that once this happens, really we'll be experiencing water quality levels that we haven't seen in over 100 years, perhaps even more. So this is perhaps pre-industrial age water quality levels. So that's a great thing to celebrate, and that's an important thing for people to know, especially since it's going to be their money that's paying for it mostly. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of this remarkable recovery that the Thames has made. So it was declared that there was no biology left, really, in very, very few species survived in the 1950s. And this was a mixture of chemical discharge, but also sewage. And there was basically no oxygen left in the river. So only organisms that could deal in very, very low oxygen were able to survive. But actually, really, over the last 60 years, there's really been this extraordinary turnaround, and it's actually back to being a very, very productive area with very high levels of biodiversity. And most of the estuary really is it's a kind of a tranquil landscape of, like, shallow creeks. You have drowned estuaries, you have low-lying islands, and broad tracts of like tidal salt marsh, which is really valuable environment. And obviously there's a lot of reclaimed grazing marsh. So a lot of beyond the flood defences, actually a lot of the land is lower than the tide. So it's actually at risk of flooding. But the areas of salt marsh, there's new areas of salt marsh that are developing at the same time. And the coastal habitats of the Greater Thames Estuary are really internationally important for their biodiversity. You support a huge amount of overwintering breeding wetland birds. And you also have a lot of rare plant and vertebrate species. So, a lot of the estuary actually is designated as a Ramsar site, which is a special protection areas. And you also have special areas of conservation in Essex. And even like the brownfield sites, which are former industrial sites, actually support kind of an open mosaic habitat. And we've got a lot of associated species, like rare invertebrate species associated with them. So it's very valuable, and I'm delighted that we didn't end up building an airport on it, because that was seriously touted at one stage. So it's also, even in closer town, actually, there's still quite a lot of biodiversity. So there's a famous picture there of seal, which we use quite a lot, which was the estuary has become a very important for harbour seals. It's become a very important nursery. Holds about 12% now of the population. So there have been big declines in other parts of the country. So in Scotland, they've experienced big declines in their seal population, whereas actually the Thames estuary has seen an increase. So it's become now nationally important. We also have harbour seals, grey seals, which are the bigger seals. We also have dolphins, so common dolphins. We have porpoises. I saw a porpoise in Hammersmith once. I almost fell down dead. I couldn't believe it. And I was trying to tell people around me, I was trying to tell people there's a porpoise, and people thought I was mad. No one saw it. And this porpoise just swam under Hammersmith Bridge and was going west. Now that probably wasn't very healthy, that porpoise. I don't think it survived, but you do get them, and people are always amazed. And you also get the avocets. The avocet has returned as well. But also just showing two pictures here of estuary edges, or if you like, sort of man-made attempts at putting back in some habitat. So the big thing really the big thing that we've lost is vegetated landscapes in the Thames estuary, and it's very difficult to put them back in. You really have to take away from the land if you're going to put them back in. So that's what they did here, because you're not allowed to build on the Thames estuary because that itself is protected habitat. So if you put in new reed beds, you have to build into the land to do it. And there have been a couple of cases where that's happened and it's worked very well. And I'll just show you this slide very quickly, but just to give you a little bit of an indication of the different types of species that you get. So you get species that are associated more with fresh water. You get a species that are associated much more with marine, and you also get those that can do both. So you get eel, for example, salmon, sea lamprey, which are species that go out to sea and come back. And what's amazing really is that because the tide is going in and out twice a day, you get the environments change. So going past you, sometimes you have freshwater environment underneath your foot, and then if you wait for an hour, it'll become marine or become more brackish. So this is constantly changing, and it's very exciting. And all this is happening. People can't see it necessarily, but it's there. So it's made this remarkable recovery, and it's done this incredible turnaround. But that's not to say that this is inevitable, that our trajectory now is towards greater and greater water quality and more biodiversity. I'll just show you a slide from the Port of London Authority, who manage the Port of London. And in their vision, kind of 20-year vision that came out a few years ago, they talk on one hand about their core business, right? So their core business is managing the imports that come in through the Thames, and also managing the boat traffic. On the other hand, and this was very promising that they did this, it's the first time they had this in one of their visions, but they had very much starting to take on their responsibility as, taking on much more responsibility than they have in the past anyway, of opening the Thames up for people, and the environment. So seeing this as much more of their core responsibility. And so there's sport, there's culture, and there's environment and heritage. But I think, where their hard figures are, where their core responsibility really lies, is in developing the port. And I think that has opportunities for economic growth, but it also does mean that there's going to be extra pressures coming down the line for the Thames. So really here, by 2035, they're hoping that in terms of the port, so importing, inland freight, so moving goods around on the estuary, and the number of passenger journeys. Basically, they're looking to double all of those things over the next 20 years, and that's significant. Now they've done it. They've zoned out the river, and there's different, obviously made sure that they've got the space for these things. They've also looked at where like sport and recreation environment would be, but there's no doubt that these two sides of this are all like they're not natural bedfellows, and that there is a challenge here in integrating both these things. So this is definitely a challenge. On top of this, we also have increased population, increased more buildings and development, more pressure for the riverside, and more to build on the riverside and riverbank. And obviously, as the river becomes cleaner, it becomes more desirable. So actually, these places, the land value of these places is going up all the time. So that is a big issue. I'm just going to talk a little bit about catchment partnerships, because I'm sure that a lot of you will know this already, but the way that in this country the water framework legislation from the EU was implemented was that river catchment would be effectively sliced up into different sections, and local groups were asked to coordinate a catchment partnership, which is to bring together the stakeholders to try and forge a common vision for that section of the river. Whether it could be the whole of a tributary, for example. So the Lee has its own catchment partnership, or it could be an estuary, which it is in our case, which is the Tidal Thames. And yes, they have a little bit of money which they give to the catchment partner, the catchment host. And the idea is to get a common vision and to bring the partners together and try and get projects together to implement that vision. So on the Tidal Thames, it is it's co-hosted by ourselves and the Thames Estuary Partnership. And I really like their logo here, which is kind of tries to represent the three different sections of the catchment partnership. And it just gives a little bit of an indication about how different the different sections are, and what a challenge it is, really. This catchment partnership is actually difficult. It's difficult to get things off the ground. So you have very much, in West London, you have very much almost like a freshwater. It is tidal, but it's really more of a freshwater environment. It feels sometimes you're more in the countryside. There's softer edges to some of the riverbanks there. You have the centre, which is much more obviously built up, flood defences the whole way along, and the water goes very, very fast. It's been very much constrained. And then when you get out to the estuary, it's much bigger. A lot of the people live much further away in lots of cases, or it's more rural in any case. It's harder to access, probably less safe to access in lots of cases. And yeah, so it's a very different type of environment. And just the way that the catchment partnership works, and what my colleague and the Thames Estuary Partnership are trying to do is kind of these three things here. So you're trying to engage stakeholders, so bring people in, starting with identifying who needs to be involved, but really trying to grow the number of people that are involved in it. Then you can move to the left to knowledge exchange and sharing information. So it's actually not that, it's difficult. If you have lots of different organizations, as you do on the Thames, lots of people are competing for the same money. They have their own projects, they have their own expertise, and bringing people together, especially when it's this complicated and there's so many different partners, is tricky. It's actually really quite difficult. Moving to the bottom right, identifying projects and project development. So if we can start sharing information and saying, start building that trust between the different organizations and familiarity, really, then you move on to sort of project identification. What needs to be done? Can we get a common vision? And then you're on to fundraising. So engaging stakeholders, local authorities, water companies, community groups, other NGOs. Project identification is really writing up your report, writing up your plan and vision. Knowledge exchange, this is sharing between ourselves, but also getting new data, citizen science, and so on. And then fundraising is really to try and power it. That we don't get enough money really from the Environment Agency, but they do have funds you can apply for. And just to give you an idea of who came to the last meeting, which was earlier this month, so the Thames Landscape Strategy, ZSL, so there's a lot of environmental charities up there, but not only that, we also had the Southwark Council came to present as well. So this might be something for IWA, might be appropriate for you to get involved. I'll leave that up to you, but the next meeting is in January and you'd be very welcome to come and contribute. So that's the Catchment Partnership. And in terms of what they struggled for a while to bring people together. They've got new people involved leading it now. And really it's the challenge really is getting people together and sitting around the same table, convincing them that it's not a waste of their time to come to the meeting in the first place, sharing what they're doing and starting to have the discussion around what are the opportunities and are we prepared to share them when those opportunities come up. And that is, it's difficult. It's difficult. It's a big piece of work really. And this has been very successful at smaller scales. And, you know, for a lot of the other, we're involved in catchment partnerships and a lot of other rivers. But it's much trickier on the Thames. So, but it's starting to build a bit of momentum, which is good. And so I'll just say that there, these are the different things that my colleagues have been looking at, but re-engage with key stakeholders might be interesting to you. So I'm just going to talk now, just the last bit, I'm going to talk about the Thames River Watch programme, which is just one of programmes. I'll just go back just the slide here, but all of these partners here have their own initiatives and projects, most of them on the Tidal Thames. So everyone's doing things. The Rivers Trust is an umbrella, but everybody else will be doing things on the Tidal Thames. So I'm just going to talk now about one that we're doing, and which has been going now for about 6 years, I think. And it is the Thames River Watch programme, and it's funded by Tideway, we're talking about at the start. But this goes back a little bit to how Thames 21 was founded, but effectively, you know, when we started in the 90s, there was plastic, but really a lot of the things that we collected were heavy waste, a lot of post-industrial waste, a lot of things that were big that once you took them out, they didn't come back, basically. However, really now what we're finding is a lot more of what the rubbish that's polluting the river is plastic packaging, and it just keeps coming back. This is Queenhithe in the City of London. You can see that the Tate Modern just across the river, and this is a heritage site, and it gets, well, there probably would have been about 600 bottles there that day, and they keep coming back. It's a lot less now than it used to be, which I'll come on to. Now, so basically what we find is that the litter doesn't just end up anywhere, it ends up in certain hotspots. So this is a floating hotspot, and it does what it says in the tin, really, everything here floats, and they end up in places on slipways like this and different strands. And this is what you tend to find at those sites. So excluding things that are too small to count, like polystyrene bits and so on. Food wrappers, cotton bud sticks, drink bottles and drink lids, and takeaway containers, both polystyrene and plastic. What's interesting there is about, you know, the top 5 items that we identify. If you exclude unidentified items, the top 5 account for almost 2/3 of everything that we identified. So it's really quite a small number of things. Food related items are a really big issue. So that was a floating hotspot. Then the other phenomenon is a sinking hotspot. So the things that sink, and they tend to be in the inside bends of rivers, of the Thames, the Tidal Thames. Now this here might look completely natural. There's a little bit of litter there, a little bit of white litter, but actually you might not notice this, but these are effectively raised bits of bed. You'll see that they aren't the same as the foreshore just upstream, where it's a lot stonier. Here it's a lot muddier. And actually, you can't see it there, but what that is a wet wipe mound. And so wet wipe mounds, they're forming in West London, in most of the inside bends where the water is going slower. This here is an example of just 1 square meter's worth of wet wipes to a depth of about 4 centimeters. So if you kept scraping, if you kept digging, you'd find more, but this is just 1 meter. So about 200 wet wipes, I think, in that particular square. So we're getting, hundreds per square meter. And while those last mounds were quite small, this is a huge mound, which is about at least 1.5 meters high compared to what it would have been. And that's happened in really quite a short period of time. It's about 100 square meters in area at least, and it's over 1.5 meters, coming up to 2 meters high. That's just an example there from a scan which showed in just 8 months it rose by 70 centimeters. So I think in over 4.5 years it increased by 1.5 meters. Just also a little bit about the distribution of the plastic. If you use plastic bottles as a proxy for floating litter, which is fairly accurate, most of the floating litter that we get, like plastic bottles and food wrappers and so on, polystyrene, is actually not in London, but is ending up in Essex and Kent. So these figures are just for Kent, for Essex, excuse me, because we haven't got the data for Kent yet. But you're talking about at least twice as much being found and recorded and in Essex compared to London, and a lot of that is actually on reed beds and salt marshes, which are of course really important habitat. In London, we're getting this phenomenon of wet wipes, which are forming these mounds, which we don't see anywhere else on the estuary. I'm sure that's to do with flow speeds or something like that, but it's a little bit showing the difference of where we get the different types of litter. We've also been working with ONELESS, who are based at ZSL, and they're trying to they're trying to eliminate single-use water bottles, as in still water bottles. And I thought this was quite interesting, is that if you look at the different type of products that you get in drink bottles, still water is 46%. So it's more like cola products are only 15%. So in terms of a product, still water is by far the most popular, and that accounts for almost half of all the bottles. And we've recorded 125,000 bottles now over the last 4 years. The other thing that we kind of battle with, I guess, on the Thames is attitude, or just a lack of engagement, I suppose, with what's going on in the river. And so a lot of people look at the brown colour and think it's polluted. Some people have heard it's won an award, so it must be okay now. And reasons for giving their assessment, a lot of people, like over 20% of people, look at it and judge it based on its colour. Or they assume because it's in London, it must be polluted. The project is basically the Thames River Watch. We're trying to work with all communities along the river, and trying to make sure that people are well versed, actively involved, and benefiting from the river. And the vision really is that we work to develop community hubs. So we're developing hubs in particular areas where the litter congregates, and we're building up not only Thames 21 volunteers, but also working with schools, working with the councils, and ultimately our intention is to work with local businesses to try and make these self-sustaining, so they don't require always support from us to keep them going. We train up volunteers to do their own cleanups, have their own insurance, and we set them up not just here but also in Essex, which they've linked up with some of the other groups in Essex, and Essex have put together their own spreadsheet of all their data, which is a fantastic resource, which I'll show you some results from. And this is one of our community hubs in Hammersmith, and this is kind of in a way the basis of a kind of a community response to the plastic issue in any case. We have, since our database started in 2016, 7,500 volunteer interactions. So that might be, people going to a cleanup. It's about 40 different groups. So it's lots of different leaders and initiatives all going along between London and Essex. In terms of the surveys, this group here actually do a survey every time they do a cleanup as well. So they put down a meter squared and they examine it, and they count everything that's in it. So 2,200 meters squared, almost 11,500 sacks of rubbish. You'll see there's a lot more from Essex than from London. So they're really bearing the brunt. It's the same in Kent actually as well. We just don't have that data. And this is extraordinary. So almost 125,000 bottles have been removed. About a quarter of them are Coca-Cola or Coca-Cola owned. And there again, you can see like 80,000 from Essex, 41,000 from London. We have some cleanups that we've done in Kent. It's about 4,000 in Kent, but there's a lot more in Kent as well. So this is the last slide now, but in terms of moving forward, I guess the environment is so challenging. It's so big. They're so complex. There are so many different competing interests on it. It's been a very hard catchment partnership to get motoring, really. And the way around that is going to be better partnerships. It's going to be giving us time to build the trust really between those partnerships. We can get a lot better at engagement with local communities. So we do that, and we're well placed to do it. But really, we're looking at really, I suppose, making it more accessible. Our diversity of the volunteers actually is not particularly diverse, I would say, and that's something for us to really look at. So we have a Thames Connections project, which is looking at explicitly that, which we're doing for a year with a view to developing programs to better engage the communities that live by the river, because that is a blind spot, I think, of all the charities that are working on the river. And this is really crucial. So how do you, it's all very well the NGOs and the authorities coming together to form something like the Catchment Partnership, but do they really represent the people who live there? Who makes those groups necessarily in charge of deciding what the river should look like or what it should do? So there needs to be a way really of improving or allowing for people who live by the river to have a say more what happens. And yeah, I mean, this is the challenge. This is a very glib line here to say improve spaces for wildlife, economy and people, but that is the challenge. So it's, yes, we want businesses on it. We want people to be using the river, but it does have, it's always going to be a trade-off. So that having a way of having a decision-making process at a forum is going to be really key. Not easy, but exciting at the same time. And I think, especially now with the Tideway Tunnel, which is due to be finished in 2024, with that coming online and the change that that's going to make to the river in terms of how much more safer it's going to be to use, there's really a huge opportunity for people to take back the river in a way, and that's what we're hoping to be a part of. So thank you.
Thank you very much, AJ. That was really interesting, and we have got a few questions coming up, but just to remind people, can you pop them in the Q&A box, and I'll put them to AJ shortly. Certainly our South London branch is, as some of you may know, is we don't have any canals, we just have a tidal river. And so certainly some of us have taken an interest in the cleanups on the Thames. In fact, I bumped into AJ when he was doing one at Battersea by the slipway there, and some of us joined in the next one that they did. We've also been involved in the one up at Barn Elms one year before the boat race, and I couldn't believe the amount of stuff we pulled out of the river. And we actually and the Richmond Council mercifully took it all away. So I'll take a look at the questions. Please keep them going. We'll start with Simon, who's asked, are there any interesting comparisons with other big estuaries in the UK, for instance, the Solent, Severn, Humber, or Mersey and Clyde? Are there any opportunities or threats that are distinct to the Thames?
Well, it's in terms of threats, I think a lot of the threats are kind of quite similar. That there's the kind of the size of the estuary is kind of does make it a particular challenge. I think the Severn maybe is similar, but we haven't probably had enough that we've tried to set up. We've had a few fora where we've looked at some of the common issues, but we haven't really been able to kind of develop a partnership with other estuaries. It's probably something that we probably should do, but I think a lot of the issues are similar. I think in terms of a lot of them will be the combined sewer overflows, development, and in a lot of cases industrial pollution as well. So there are similarities, and I think one of the challenges we've had is the kind of sheer size and the length of the estuary in terms of trying to get partners together. But there probably is more. There's definitely a space for a forum for those partners, and that's something that we've tried to do through the Capital Partnership. But it's partly just getting everyone together. It might be easier now, actually, that everyone's used to this sort of online setup, and that's probably something we should do more of.
Certainly does allow a lot of people to meet together that don't have to then travel miles and miles. Another question from Simon, who is working to reduce the amount of plastic getting into the rivers? I guess the wet wipes are nearly all via sewers. There's a plan for that, but what about plastic bottles? Do we know how and where they get into the river?
So it's tricky. We don't really know much about how they get into the river. We have our theories. We have different pathways, such as bins overflowing. So we've had evidence of bins not being emptied in time, and people very helpfully leaving their rubbish beside the bins, beside the river, and that's one source. But it's very, very hard to assess where they're actually coming from. So there's a certain amount coming from the tributaries, so it might be easier for them to get into tributaries and therefore making their way into the river, into the tidal section that way. But we don't know much about it. And actually, part of the challenge is that there are certain things that we know where they're coming from. So one of the big things is plastic cups, which now has got even worse. So plastic cups from riverside bars, basically. And that's doubled this year compared to last year. So there's been a huge increase. And that's with a shorter opening period, because pubs only started opening, I think, in July. But in order to do that, effectively the problem is that no one's paying us to run a campaign. We will do it, and we are going to do it, but because all of our like for Thames, it basically comes down to a funding problem. We're funded by project, and no funder really is going to fund you to campaign on something like that. So it's almost like a business model issue, that the organizations that are set up by membership, where they have unrestricted funding, are much better able to respond to those types of issues. That's exactly what we want to do, and that's a very good. So that's a brilliant one to do in terms of it's quite fixable. And there's other things like takeaway containers is probably one we would go to next, because those can be very easily replaced with paper. There's different things we can do, and it's just about getting the time and the resource to put aside to do those things, because we're not set up in that way. But you also trying to build the partnerships more. But it's difficult, and the industries are, I think we're going to have to be very strategic about the way we do it and build big partnerships to do that, I think.
Thank you. A slightly related question, Pippa Alston has asked, how effective are the floating litter traps that we've seen more in the Thames? Are they simply monitoring, and could there be more?
So they're placed by the Port of London Authority, and they're placed mainly in places where they're not in the way, because obviously there's a huge amount of traffic where they're placed. So they do pick out quite a lot. You know, they pick out. I think in total, if you include that waste and the waste that we give the Port of London Authority, it's about 300 tons a year. So it is a lot. Could there be more? I don't think so. I think they've looked at where they have space for them. But they're filling up faster. I've heard anecdotally that they're filling up faster than they used to. So it's still a big issue for them.
Right. She's also asked, are the commercial river users playing their part fully?
No.
Big answer.
No, I think like we had a video of one of the cruises basically throwing their waste directly into the river, and it's not always on purpose, like not on purpose, by accident, but no, I would say, and they need to.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier the meeting. Alan Ashby asks, did Thames Water attend the last meeting, as they weren't listed as having done so?
No, they didn't. And part of our remit will be to get them there, yeah, and get them more interested. They have been there in the past, and we're sort of building it back up again. So I expect that they will come. Yeah, they're sort of going through a bit of a structural change themselves at the moment, so that might be part of the reason. But I expect they will be back.
Right. Thank you. Talking about partners. Ian Israel asks, what would be your wish list when asking the IWA, or presumably for any other organisation, to participate as a partner?
Well, there's going to be lots of opportunities, really. So in terms of, I suppose it depends a little bit about your own relationship with the Tidal Thames, but there's in terms of riverboat users, there's our key, like when we developed our vision about 6 years ago now, you know, the riverboat users and houseboats were a big part of that. So they were a big part of the vision in terms of what they needed. How do we improve, like how do we make things easier for that sector and for those users, boat users? So I can imagine, I'm not sure exactly what your relationship is with the Tidal Thames, but I would imagine in terms of expertise around kind of planning permissions, I think there's a real lack of capacity within the sector to deal with planning. And we basically had to, I think before I started, actually, we were trying to respond to planning applications, but we just didn't have the resource, and we didn't have, I suppose we didn't have the experience. It wasn't something that we were funded to do. And that's part of our issue all the time. So I can imagine expertise might be something that would be really beneficial, and just an additional voice. You can certainly come along to the next meeting. You can even give a presentation on what you do in your models, which might be relevant to us. It would be very interesting. We're trying to get speakers in from that might not necessarily have to be part of the partnership going forward, but might show examples of what they've done. And I think actually that would be really useful.
Your comment about planning, there used to be a group called the London Rivers Association, and I used to go to that as part of the IWA, and they had people from the different boroughs, and they had river users and all sorts of different organisations. And the beauty of that was, when it came to planning, is that it was a balanced response that the group did as a whole, because you could, unfortunate that organisation has actually folded. But in London, we have got our own London Planning and Conservation group, and I can talk to you outside the meeting about that, and how we can link in with in IWA with you.
Yeah.
Keep the questions coming. Well, we've got one or two more, I think. Another one from Pippa. Are you engaged with measures to counter potential flooding, and will there be conflicts with habitat restoration, etc.?
So yes, we are. So there's conflicts, but also opportunities. So one of the things that we are going for is European funding looking at habitat restoration as part of flood mitigation. So looking at improving like a managed, they call it managed realignment. So moving your flood defenses further inland and allowing the I suppose the sea or the river to take back certain sections of land and turn them back into salt marsh. So and also that acts as a bit of a barrier. It soaks up some of the pressure and some of the water usage. It gives it more. It gives the water more places to go, basically. So there's a huge opportunity there, and there's it's obviously it's expensive. It's very expensive. You're obviously taking away land that has been farmed, but is in any case is probably going to be at risk because of rising sea levels. So there's a big opportunity. I think the big thing in terms of when we're talking about sea level rise is that our flood defenses are going to have to go up. So there's an issue really, I suppose, of disconnecting people more from the river. And that's going to be an issue. That is definitely I think engaging communities around what's happening and how they want it to happen is going to be really important.
Yeah. Thank you. Now, we've come to the end of the questions people have already put in, but my experience of these webinars is that suddenly people think of things at the last minute. So if anyone else has got anything they want to ask, can you pop it in the question and answer now?
There was a question from Jenny Bryce in the chat about 106 money. And actually, yeah, no, that again, we haven't. And we've talked about it and we've tried, but we haven't managed. And there's a lot of money. There's a lot of Section 106 money. But yeah, that's a bit of a challenge trying to access it. I'm not sure have you had much more success?
Sorry, Jenny, I hadn't spotted you put that into the chat. Right, well, if there's no more questions, I'd just like to thank AJ very much for a fascinating presentation. There are a few comments coming to the chat about how interesting people have found it. I will be keeping in touch with him as before. And our national chairman has just said a great presentation and a great initiative. I'd certainly be keen to come to your next meeting. So that's good. Yeah. That's excellent news. Yeah, and I would certainly be interested in doing the same, as my branch is actually South London.
Fantastic.
So I'd really like to thank you for what's been a very interesting evening, and I think people have come from near and far, as often is the case on the webinars, and that shows the degree of interest in what you have to talk to us about. So thank you so much, and appreciate your time when you've had a busy day, and I look forward to liaising with you after the meeting.
Great, thanks very much.
Just to let everybody know what I had told you all that we were going to continue with having webinars because we really don't know what's happening. We are going to continue to have London Region webinars into 2021, and they will be, as this one is, on the 4th Monday in the month. So 25th January, 22nd of February, and 22nd of March, which most of you have got if you've got the information out. However, hot off the press, some of us had a meeting with CNRT on Friday about their current consultation on managing boats on London's waterways. And they've got some consultation out at the moment. It's about facilities, about mooring strategies, and so on and so forth. and we've invited them to come and do a webinar for us, which is open to all. And this will be next month, but obviously earlier in the month. It'll be in December. It'll be on Monday, the 14th of December. So I will be sending that. I will be sending that round to everybody, and hope very much that you can join us.